Kate
I know where
Sterling
it
once
is,
believed
but I
surviving
can't
meant
stay here.
staying silent. Then her
Meet me at
husband
the
hit
bridge
her
in
while she
10
carried their
minutes,
unborn
alone.
child, and silence was no longer an option. With one secret phone call, the woman he underestimated becomes someone he never saw coming. Not broken, not helpless, but ready to take back her name, her home, and her future.
He hit her so hard, she hit the marble floor before she could even make a sound. His ring split her cheek open, the taste of blood instant. In that moment, hands shielding her pregnant belly, 29-year-old Kate Sterling looked up at her husband and felt something inside her finally snap. It was not her spirit, and it was not her will to live. It was her patience. Because what Richard Sterling did not know, what no one in their wealthy Connecticut town ever asked, was who Kate's father really was. And tonight, he was coming for his daughter. Now, if you are hooked on this story, please subscribe to follow Kate's incredible journey. I would also love it if you left a comment telling me what city you are from. It is amazing to see how far these stories travel. Rain had been hitting the windows since 4 p.m. That cold Connecticut rain that made the long private driveway look like a slick black mirror. A 14-foot-tall iron gate guarded the end of the driveway. Along the stone wall, the tiny red lights of security cameras blinked in the storm. From the outside, the mansion was a fortress, built by a man who spent 30 years showing off every single dollar he had. Inside, Kate stood at the kitchen island, her hands gripping a mug of chamomile tea that had long gone cold. She was not listening to the storm, or the furnace, or the television she had on for company. No, she was listening for the crunch of tires on wet gravel. She listened for the familiar rumble of Richard's car, the slam of his door, and the click of his shoes on the stone path. For 3 years, those were the sounds that warned her to brace herself. She set the mug down and placed a hand on her stomach. 7 months. She whispered it to herself like a prayer. The baby moved, a slow roll just below her ribs. Kate breathed out slowly, the way the therapist she secretly saw twice had told her to. She had to stop going after Richard found the receipt. Then, at 9:47, headlights sliced across the kitchen window. The engine was cut. The car door slammed. His footsteps echoed on the walkway. She picked up her mug, carried it to the sink, and stood with her back to the door. She had learned a long time ago that it was better if he did not think she was waiting up. Looking like she was waiting made him angry. But looking like she did not care also made him angry. There was no right way to stand, no safe expression, no tone of voice that would protect her. But she had learned which was more dangerous and which was less. She lived by these silent rules, like someone in a house with a rotten floor. You always step carefully, and you never forget it is there. The front door was thrown open. He always pulled it too hard, making the sound echo through the marble hall. She heard his keys slap the table. She heard him sigh with frustration. And then she turned around. Richard Sterling was 54 and had been handsome all his life. He was tall with broad shoulders, perfect gray hair, and blue eyes that could seem kind. He wore his charcoal suit for his city meetings, and its shoulders were soaked with rain. His face was tight in a way she recognized right away, a silent rage simmering just under the surface, like pressure building under ice. He just stared at her without a word. "There is soup on the stove," Kate said, her voice perfectly calm. She was an expert at keeping her voice calm. "And I made that bread you like. It is still warm." Richard walked right by her, ignoring the food and ignoring her completely. He went straight to the liquor cabinet, poured 2 fingers of whiskey, and drank half of it in one swallow. Kate just stood still and waited. "Hennessy pulled out," he finally said. She knew not to ask for details. She knew Hennessy was a huge development deal he had been chasing for a year. She had heard the name whispered on phone calls she was not supposed to overhear. "I am so sorry," she said. "Are you?" he sneered. It was not a real question. He finished his drink. "You're sorry. That helps a lot, Kate. Really, is there anything I can do?" He laughed, a sharp, cold sound. "What could you possibly do? What value do you even have?" He slammed the glass down. "I have carried this house, this marriage, for 3 years. The one time I need a win, I come home to you looking like a scared rabbit." Kate kept her arms loose at her sides. "I am not scared. You should be," he said, and then he started toward her. And that was the signal. The thing she had learned to watch for. That switch that flipped from his quiet anger to something far worse. It always happened so fast, faster than anyone who has not lived through it could ever imagine. One moment he was at the counter, the next he was 3 feet away, then 2, and the air around him felt electric. It felt sharp, dangerous, like the air before lightning. "Richard." Her voice was low, not from fear, but from pure instinct. "Richard, stop." "Stop what?" "I am in my own kitchen." He was so close she could smell the whiskey on his breath, and under it, the bitter scent of his day-long fury. "You are telling me to stop? Who do you think you are? What would you be without me? Please do not do this tonight." "Do what? Talk to my wife?" His hand shot out and grabbed her upper arm. Not hard enough to bruise. He was always careful about that, but tight enough to hold her. "You have been nothing but a weight on me since our wedding day. You are hurting me." His voice dropped to a dangerously calm whisper. His grip tightened. "I am talking to you. The baby," she said, using the word like a shield. She knew that sometimes that one word could stop him. "Richard, you are going to hurt the baby." A strange look crossed his face. For just a second, she thought it worked. She thought she saw the anger in his eyes begin to soften. And then his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down, and whatever he saw on that screen shattered the last of his self-control. He shoved her hard, with both hands on her shoulders. She stumbled back, her arm hitting the sharp edge of the kitchen counter. And that is when he hit her, a hard slap across the right side of her face. It was so hard her head snapped to the side, and her vision went white for a moment. And then she was falling, her knees hitting the marble floor first. Her hands shot out automatically to break her fall. A strange choked sound escaped her. She heard him say something, but the blood was pounding too loud in her ears to understand. She was on her knees, one hand pressed to her burning face, the other held flat against her stomach, shaking. But she knew it was not from weakness or fear. It was just her body's physical reaction to the shock. She could taste the metallic flavor of blood where her teeth had split her cheek. "Get up," Richard said. His voice was cold, and his cold voice was somehow even scarier than his rage. "Get up off the floor. You look pathetic." Kate looked up at him. She had been on this same floor looking up at him before. Twice, to be exact. She was keeping score, she always did. And both of those other times, some part of her tried to shrink, to be quiet, to do anything to make him stop. But this time was different. She did not know what her face looked like. But Richard actually took a small step back from her. She pushed herself up slowly, using the counter for balance. She stood on her own 2 feet, hand still on her cheek, and looked her husband right in the eye without blinking. "I am going upstairs," she said. "We are not finished here. I am going upstairs," she repeated. The same words, the same calm voice. And something about her calm repetition, how even her tone was, made him fall silent. She walked right past him, out of the kitchen, through the cold hallway, and up the winding stairs. She could feel his eyes on her the whole time. She never looked back. She went into their bedroom, closed the door, and stood in the dark for 30 seconds, pressing her forehead against the cool wood, forcing herself to breathe. She moved across the room, sat on the bed, and slid open the drawer of the nightstand. Her fingers brushed past lip balm, a book she had not touched in 6 months, and some antacids. And then she felt it. A phone. But this was not her phone. It was not the expensive one Richard bought her, the one he used to track her location. It was not the phone he looked through while he thought she was asleep. This was a cheap, prepaid burner she had purchased with cash from a gas station months ago. She hid it in her purse, moving it to this drawer every single night before he got home. She bought it for an emergency. When she switched it on, the screen's light cut through the dark. Even after 3 months in a drawer, it still had a 40% charge. She just looked at it. Her cheek was already beginning to swell, the hot sting of a bruise forming under her skin. Her hands were shaking, so she gripped them together tightly to make them stop. The phone had only one number saved in it. Just one. No name, just a contact with an international code. A number she had memorized when other kids were busy learning their times tables. She had promised herself she would never, ever have to use it, and she truly meant that. She knew when she bought it, knew as she typed the number in the gas station parking lot with trembling fingers, that making this call would change her entire life. It would burn down bridges that could never be rebuilt. It would start a fire that she could not control. She sat there on the bed, her hand resting on her swollen cheek. Her unborn baby moved inside her, and she thought about burning bridges. She thought about what was on the other side. She thought about the woman she was before she became Mrs. Richard Sterling, and what that woman would tell her to do right now. She pressed the call button. It only rang twice. A voice on the other end said, "Katya." It was deep, accented, and perfectly calm, the way truly dangerous men sound, because they have never had a reason to be anything else. It was a voice that hadn't changed at all in the 10 years since she last heard it. "Papa," she said, before slipping into Russian without a second thought. Her childhood language always took over when she felt scared. It never asked for permission, it just appeared. She spoke 4 quick sentences, explaining what happened and what she needed. There was a 3-second pause on the other end. "Where is he now?" her father asked. "He's downstairs." "Is the gate code the same one I have?" She had sent it 3 months ago, on the day she bought the phone, just in case, she had told herself. "Yes," she said. "Go to the east wing," her father ordered. "The room at the end of the hall. Stay there. Do not open the door for anyone unless they say the name." "What name?" she asked. "Sunrise," he said. "You remember," and she did. She was only 7 when she learned it. It was the safe word. The word that meant your family was on its way to get you, and that you were safe. "How long will it take?" she asked. "We are already in Connecticut," her father answered. And then the line went dead. Kate just sat there, with the phone resting in her lap. She closed her eyes and took a very deep breath, in through her nose and out through her mouth. The baby moved again, a slow little somersault high up on her ribs. She pressed a hand against the tiny kick and whispered in Russian what her mother used to say. "We are all right. We are going to be all right now." She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the rain. For a moment, she only saw her reflection, the swollen cheek, her dark eyes, and the nightgown that was basically her uniform. Then she looked past her own reflection, to the gate at the end of the long driveway. She could just see the small, red blinking light of the security system. She watched it for a second. Then she turned from the window, left the bedroom, and walked down the hall to the east wing. Downstairs, Richard had poured a third glass of whiskey and was in his study, phone pressed to his ear, making a list of people to blame for a bad business deal. His lawyer was number 1. His project manager was number 2. He had not gotten to his own name yet, and he probably never would. He was the kind of man whose whole life was built on his own success, so any failure had to be someone else's fault. "I need you to call Franklin," he was saying. "First thing tomorrow, you tell him I want to see him. Not a phone call, a face-to-face meeting. You tell him." He suddenly stopped talking. He heard a noise. It wasn't coming from inside the house. It was from outside. A sound that simply did not belong there. He walked to his study window and looked out, but the rain was coming down so hard the night was pitch black. He could not see anything but his own reflection in the glass. Then the security light at the front gate went dark. It just completely turned off. Richard frowned, pressing his face closer to the window. Something was coming up the driveway, something long and dark and slow. Then he saw there was more than one. He counted 1, then 2, then 3. By the time he saw the 4th, he had pulled the phone from his ear, staring with wide eyes, his brain scrambling to understand what he was seeing. 4 black SUVs were moving silently up his driveway. Their headlights were off, their windshield wipers were on, and the rain almost completely hid the sound of their engines. "Richard?" His lawyer's voice sounded small and very far away. "Richard, are you still there?" Richard Sterling had survived for 30 years in ruthless real estate by trusting his gut, and right then, his gut was screaming. It was telling him something was wrong, on a level he couldn't even begin to understand. "I will call you back," he said, and he hung up. He walked to his desk drawer and took out the pistol he kept there, a 9mm Sig Sauer he bought when a rival made threats 6 years ago. The threats were nothing, but they had scared him enough to get a gun license. He had not even fired the thing in 4 years. He picked it up and checked his magazine, trying to remember what the instructor at the range had taught him. He was still standing there behind his desk when the front door of his mansion just swung open. He did not hear a knock. He did not hear the alarm. Both of those things should have been impossible. He moved out of his study into the hallway, holding the gun down by his side. He was afraid, but right then he was more embarrassed by his fear than actually scared. The entryway lights were on. He could see the marble floor, the small table with his keys, and the large mirror hanging above it. And in that mirror, he saw 2 Sioux men stepping silently through his front door. They wore black rain jackets, moving with a quiet, practiced skill that told him these were not men who had come to talk. And more of them were coming in right behind them. "What?" He raised the gun. "This is private property. I have a weapon." "I will." The man on the left just glanced at the gun with a look of pure boredom. He reached out and simply took it from Richard's hand, so smoothly that Richard did not even realize he had let go. He just stood there, empty-handed, staring at this man who now held his gun pointed at the floor, like he had held 1,000 others exactly like it. "Mr. Sterling," the man said. His English was perfect, but there was an accent Richard could not quite place. Eastern European, maybe Russian. "Please do not do that again. It creates problems that nobody here wants. Who are you?" Richard's voice was almost steady. "Who sent you? If this is about the Hennessy deal, Mr. Sterling." The man put the gun on the table next to Richard's keys. That calm, casual move was somehow more frightening than any threat he could have possibly made. "My name is not important," the man continued. "The name that is important belongs to the man waiting outside. He would like to have a word with you." I am not speaking to anyone until you tell me what the hell is going on in my house." The man's expression did not change at all. "Your house," he said. "Yes, we can definitely talk about that." He then stepped to the side, gesturing toward the open door, toward the rain and the dark. Richard Sterling glanced at the open door, at the men standing on either side, and then he looked up the staircase that led to his wife. He was beginning to realize she had started something tonight that was far beyond anything he could ever have imagined. He walked to the door. Standing on the mansion's front steps, with rain pouring down and 4 black SUVs parked on his driveway, was a man Richard Sterling had never seen before. He looked to be about 60 years old, maybe a little older. Age had settled on him like solid rock, not like extra weight. He was wearing a dark overcoat without an umbrella, and the rain did not seem to bother him at all. Or maybe he had just decided a long time ago not to worry about things he could not control. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, perfectly still, just looking at the house. When Richard finally appeared in the doorway, the man's eyes moved to him. They were pale eyes, either blue or gray. It was hard to tell in the rain. And they looked Richard over with the slow, careful focus of someone taking inventory. "Mr. Sterling," the man said. His English was even better than the men inside, formal and almost elegant. "My name is Mikhail Vulov. I believe we have a great deal to discuss." He paused. "About my daughter." Richard Sterling felt the ground disappear from under him, and it was not the storm. He said, "I don't think Kate's father is," and then he stopped. He was about to say dead, but the man standing right there was very much alive. In that moment, he realized every single thing Kate had ever told him about her family was a lie. "Yes," said Mikhail Vulov with the faintest smile. "I think we should go inside now." He walked through the front door of the Sterling mansion as if he owned it. And Richard would soon find out that was not far from the truth. He did not look around the room, impressed by the money. He glanced over the marble floors, the crystal chandelier, the expensive paintings. It was how a man inspects a hotel room, noticing what is useful and ignoring everything else. 2 of his men moved in front of him, and 2 more fell in behind. No one said a word. They did not have to. Richard Sterling took 3 steps back, then forced himself to stop. Deep down, some stubborn part of him was still Richard Sterling. And Richard Sterling did not back down from anyone in his own house. He demanded, "I want to know who gave you the authority to set foot on my property." His voice had a hint of its old power. Not all of it, but just enough. "Whatever this is, whatever you think you're doing, you should know I have lawyers who will." "Sit down, Mr. Sterling." It was not a request. The tone was polite, but underneath it was as hard as steel. Richard heard it, loud and clear, so he sat down. He fell into the chair by the fireplace, the one his wife used on Sunday mornings. He sat there stiffly, trying to look like he chose to sit, not that he was ordered to. Mikhail Vulov remained standing. "My daughter," he said, "called me about 47 minutes ago. Do you have any idea what she told me?" Richard stayed silent. Vulov went on, with the patient calm of a man who had done this many times before. "She told me that her husband hit her while she was carrying his child." He let the words hang there in the air. Then he added, "She told me this in Russian." "Did you know she could speak Russian, Mr. Sterling?" After a long pause, he whispered, "No." Vulov clasped his hands behind his back. "There are many things you don't know about my daughter. We'll get to all of them. But first, I need you to answer one simple question. I like to know who I'm dealing with. Did you hit her?" Richard's jaw clenched. "That's between my wife and me." The man to Vulov's left, the one who had taken his gun, took a half step forward. Just one small step, but Richard felt the temperature in the room plummet. "Did you hit her?" Vulov asked again, his voice perfectly steady. "It was. We had a disagreement. Things got out of hand." "I did not mean to. Yes or no, Mr. Sterling?" The silence was crushing. Richard Sterling stared into Miki Vulov's eyes and saw a kind of patience that did not need anger, because it always won. He was the one who looked away first. "Yes," he admitted. Vulov gave a single slow nod, like someone who already knew the answer. "Thank you," he said, "for your honesty. That will make things simpler." He turned and started walking toward the grand staircase. Richard began to stand up, but two of the men moved, and he sat right back down. They did not have to touch him. He understood. "Where is she?" Vulov asked, not looking at Richard, but at the man on his right. The man took out a phone, spoke Russian, listened, and then said in English, "East wing, end of the hall." Vulov started up the stairs. Richard sat in his chair, listening to the footsteps, and counted the men in the room. 3, with more outside. He did the math, and he really did not like the answer. Upstairs, in a dark room at the end of the east wing, Kate heard a knock. She was on the floor with her back to the wall, knees pulled up to her pregnant belly, holding a burner phone. She had not turned on any lights. It felt safer in the dark, where she could not see her own reflection, could not see her own face. And then the knock came. 2 short taps, then one long one. A signal she had not heard since she was a little girl. She got up and opened the door. Her father stared at her face for exactly 2 seconds. For a split second, something flickered in his cold, controlled eyes. Then he stepped forward and put both hands on her cheeks, as gently as if he were holding something priceless. He turned her face to the light. The bruise was completely visible now. The right side of her face, from her cheek down to her jaw, was a deep, angry red that was already turning purple. Miki Vulov looked at it for a long time. He lowered his hands and said very quietly in Russian, "I should have come sooner, Papa." Her voice cracked, and she hated how weak she sounded. But she was 7 months pregnant. Her face ached, and her father was here for the first time in 10 years. Her body just could not pretend to be strong anymore. "How did you even?" She stopped herself, switching to English, then back to Russian. "I did not think you would come yourself." "Where else would I be?" he asked. He came into the room, gave her his complete attention, and said, "Let me look at you." He was not looking at the bruise anymore. He was looking right at her, the way he did when she was small, like he was checking her strength. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" The baby is fine." I checked. "I have been monitoring." "Good." He pulled a chair from a corner and placed it in front of her before sitting down. That simple move, him sitting, putting himself below her eye level, broke something inside her. "Sit," he said. She sat on the bed, and they just stared at each other. 10 years, she whispered. 10 years, he agreed. "You did not come to the wedding. You did not invite me." "Because you knew," she stopped, biting her lip. "I knew what you would have done if you met him. I knew what you would have discovered. I wanted." She just looked down at her hands. "I wanted to believe I made the right choice. I needed to believe it, without you here to prove me wrong." Vulov was silent for a moment. And now, she looked right at him. "He hit me, Papa. While I am pregnant. While I am carrying his son." Her voice was strong again. She had found her strength in the last 30 seconds. That was the 3rd time. The 3rd time. She watched her father's face as he processed that number, saw his perfect stillness. It was not a lack of feeling, but a powerful, rigid control over it. "You should have called me after the first time," he said. "I know. Why did not you? And that was the real question, was it not? The one she had been asking herself for 2.5 years. She looked at her father, the man who raised her in a world of power, violence, and loyalty. The man who sent her away at 19 for a better life. He had let her go and respected her wishes. She tried to find the real answer. Because calling you meant admitting I had failed, she said. And calling you meant I would be your daughter again. Not Kate Sterling. Not just Kate. But Katya Volova, your heir. She paused. I was not ready for that. And now, she looked at him, her gaze steady. He hit me for the 3rd time, while I am 7 months pregnant. I am ready. Downstairs, Richard Sterling had been in that chair for 9 minutes. He was counting. He was also studying the men, looking for any weakness, any opening. There were none. These men were not security guards or bouncers. They were something else concerned completely. He knew it the way a rabbit knows the difference between a dog and a wolf. He tried a new approach. I want to speak to whoever is in charge, he announced. Nobody moved. The man who came in. Vulov. I want to talk to him now. He tried to put his commanding boardroom voice back on. I understand he is upset. As a father, I can respect that. But there are 2 sides to every story, and if we all just sit down, the 3 of us, with Kate, we can. Mr. Sterling, the man who took his gun, was looking at him. We appreciate your patience. I am not being patient. You are being patient, the man said. His tone slammed the conversation shut like a steel door. Richard closed his mouth. For 30 years, he had been the most powerful man in almost every room he walked into. He always knew it. But not this room. Not anymore. The feeling this night was completely out of his control had been growing since those cars pulled into his driveway. Every new detail was heavier than the one before. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He reached for it slowly, watching the men, but nobody stopped him. He looked at his phone. It was his lawyer. He answered. Richard, what is going on? I was waiting for you to call. I need you to look up a name, his lawyer said, his voice low and serious. Do it now. The name is Miki Vulov. He is Eastern European, maybe Russian, in real estate, something called Vulov. There was a short pause on the line, and then a much, much longer one. Richard, where are you? I am at home. Why? What is it? I am looking. His lawyer's voice cracked, his confidence completely gone. Richard, the Vulov name. There is a Mikhail Vulov tied to the Vulov syndicate. The government has massive files on these people. Richard heard furious typing. Richard, you do not negotiate with people like this. You do not. Why are you asking about this name? He is in my house, Richard said. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Get out of there, his lawyer whispered. Now. Do whatever you have to. Just get out. Richard looked at the 3 men standing around him and the 2 more guarding the front door. He thought about the staircase where Vulov had gone 20 minutes ago. I really do not think that is an option, he said, and hung up the phone. 23 minutes had now passed. When Vulov returned, he walked with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly how this would end. And Kate was not with him. Richard saw it right away. Where is my wife? She is resting, Vulov said, as he sat in a chair right across from Richard. It was not Richard's chair, but one placed there just for this moment. Vulov was completely calm. She needs her rest. We are not going to disturb her. She is my wife, Richard said, and he hated the desperation in his own voice. Whatever she told you, whatever you think happened. I know what happened tonight, Vulov said flatly. My daughter told me. You told me, and the bruise on her face tells me. He leaned back just a little. Mr. Sterling, I want to tell you about my family. I think it will help you understand the situation you are in. He paused. My daughter grew up in a world most people do not even know is real. She was educated in 4 countries. She speaks 5 languages, including one she stopped speaking the day she married you. From a young age, she was trained to handle huge assets, navigate complex legal systems, and make decisions most rich men like you will never face. He watched Richard, waiting for him to react. She left that life behind because I gave her a choice. I loved her enough to let her find her own path, and that path, it led her to you. Richard said nothing. She chose a man, Vulov continued, who had no idea who she really was, who just saw a beautiful, quiet, and intelligent woman, and thought she was something he could control, something he could easily break. He tilted his head. How long did it take for you to hit her? Silence. 8 months, Richard said. He wasn't sure why he admitted it. The words just spilled out. Vulov just stared at him. 8 months into your marriage. Richard started to make an excuse, but he stopped. There was nothing he could say. 8 months, Vulov repeated, very slowly. She stayed for 3 years. I want you to think about what that says about my daughter's hope. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and the entire room seemed to shrink. And I want you to think about what it means that she finally called me. My daughter would only make that call when she was absolutely done. Richard's mouth was completely dry. What do you want, money? I want you to listen, Vulov said. He wasn't angry, not even a little bit, and that was somehow much more terrifying. You are going to listen to me, and you will understand precisely what is going to happen next. Then, you will sign the documents my people have prepared, and we will be finished here. Documents? Richard sat up straight. What documents? I have not agreed to anything. Mr. Sterling. Vulov simply raised a hand, and it was enough to make him stop talking. You hit my pregnant daughter 3 times during your marriage. Tonight, you hit her hard enough to draw blood. I have a doctor on the way to document her injuries. I also have financial investigators who just spent the last 90 days looking into every account and company you own. He paused. I have been preparing for this day since she married you. A cold chill shot right down Richard's spine. You have been watching me? I have been protecting my daughter, Vulov corrected him. There is a big difference. She did not know. It was her choice to live without my help, and I respected that. But I was always prepared, because I know men like you, Mr. Sterling. I knew this call would eventually come. He reached into his coat, pulled out a document, and placed it on the table. Divorce. A full transfer of every single one of your assets. The Greenwich house, the properties in New York, the 3 accounts in the Cayman Islands. Yes, I know about all of those. Everything will go to my daughter, complete, and without any struggle from you. Richard stared at the papers. He looked up. And if I refused to sign? The room became so quiet you could feel the heaviness of it, the silence of men holding their breath. Vulov looked at him for a long, heavy moment. Then we will have to discuss the alternative, he said. And I promise you, Mr. Sterling, you do not want to discuss the alternative. Richard's hands were shaking, so he pressed them flat on his legs. His mind was racing, thinking of every possible option, every single person he could call, every favor he could ask for. But every idea just vanished. He was starting to see that the man across from him had already thought of every move, like a chess grandmaster playing against a small child. You cannot do this legally, Richard said. These papers will never hold up in court. I will fight this, You will find, Vulov said quietly, that they are perfectly legal, completely solid. They were drafted over the last 6 weeks by 3 of the best lawyers in New York. He paused. And you will find that the evidence of your assault, along with the financial crimes my team uncovered, will make fighting this much more painful than simply signing. Richard's voice was just a whisper. Who are you? I already told you who I am. No, Richard looked at him. I mean, who are you really? Kate told me her father was a property developer from Eastern Europe. She said he died when she was 12. She said. Vulov interrupted what I instructed her to say. A flicker of something that looked like guilt crossed his face. I made her say that to protect her, so that anyone who got close to her could not use her to get to me. He looked at Richard with an expression that was almost like pity. It was not fair to her. I can see that now. Upstairs, in a bedroom down the hall, Kate Sterling sat with her hands resting on her stomach. Her back was straight, her face was calm, like a person who had no more tears to cry. It was not peace, but it was resolve. She listened to the rain tapping against the window and thought about being 19 years old, putting her father on a plane and promising him she would build a normal life. She thought about what that normal life had become. The first year, she believed in it. The second year, she saw the cracks. By the third year, those cracks were giant holes. But she was so stubborn, so determined not to be Katya Volkova, that she accepted things no woman should ever have to accept. She stayed in a house that felt more like a cage, telling herself every single morning that this was her choice, that she was the one in control, that she was not her father's daughter. She pressed her hands to her stomach, and the baby moved, a slow, determined kick. She was her father's daughter. She had been the entire time. And tonight, sitting in the dark in a mansion that was no longer Richard Sterling's, she finally stopped fighting that truth. It settled over her, not like a cage, but like a suit of armor. She heard footsteps, then a soft knock on the door. One of her father's men walked in. Volova, he said. It was the first time in 10 years anyone had called her that. It felt different now, not like a chain, but like a key. Your father would like to know if you are ready to come downstairs. Kate looked at the door, then at her own hands. She pictured Richard's cold expression in the kitchen as he stared down at her on the floor. His absolute certainty that she meant nothing. She thought about the simple respect he showed everyone else in the world, but never her. And then she stood up. Yes, she was ready. She walked to the top of the staircase and looked down into the hall of a house she'd lived in for 3 years and never once felt safe in. She saw her father sitting across from her husband, the document on the table between them. She saw Richard's face when he heard her footsteps, when he looked up and saw her standing right there. And for the very first time since their wedding day, Kate watched Richard Sterling look at her with actual fear in his eyes. She walked down the stairs, slowly, with purpose. Her entire posture had changed from just 2 hours ago. Something deep in her spine had finally straightened itself out. It was not a show of defiance or an act, but the quiet return of a part of herself that had been waiting for a very long time. She crossed the room and stood beside her father's chair where Richard looked up at her. "Kate," he said, his voice completely empty, all of its usual power just gone. What was left was weak and tiny. "Kate, please listen to me. Whatever he told you, whatever promises he made, this is not you. You are not one of them. You are my wife, and we have a baby on the way. If you would just—" Richard, her voice was quiet, but it was final. "Sign the paper." He just stared. "Sign the paper," she repeated. And this all ends tonight. Everyone can go home. You walk away with your health and whatever your lawyers can manage to save." She held his gaze. "Do not sign it," she warned, "and my father will explain the alternative. And I promise you, Richard, that is not a conversation you want to have." She watched as he searched her face for the woman he married, for the obedience, the fear, the weakness he relied on, and saw that she was simply gone. Or maybe she was never really there to begin with, just a version of her he borrowed for a while, and the loan had just been called in. He reached for the pen. It scratched across the page at 11:22 p.m., Richard Sterling's hand shaking so badly, his signature was a complete mess, nothing like his own. He knew it. He stared at that weak, trembling version of his own name, and something inside of him just broke. Like a building that doesn't fall all at once, but collapses floor by painful floor. He dropped the pen. Nobody spoke. Volkov's man, the one with the bored look, picked up the paper. He glanced at the signature and gave Volkov a short nod. Volkov looked at it for a moment, then folded it and put it in his coat without a second thought. Just another task completed, another box checked off his list. Richard stared at Kate. She was still by her father's chair, her hands on her stomach, her face a perfect, unreadable mask. He searched for anger or satisfaction, anything, but found only a deep calm that terrified him more than any rage ever could. "You planned this," he said, his voice hollow. "You have been planning this the whole time." "I made one phone call," Kate said. "Tonight, right after you threw me on the floor. Do not." His jaw tightened. "Do not you dare make this sound simple. Don't you dare make it sound like." He jumped to his feet so fast the other two men in the room tensed up, and they only froze when Volkov calmly raised a hand. Richard just stood there, trembling with a rage that had nowhere to go. "You lied to me. For 3 years you lived in my house and you lied about everything. Your family, your real name, all of it." Kate looked at him, her gaze completely steady. "I never lied about who I am. I showed you exactly who I was. You were the one who chose to see me as something smaller. Your father is." He gestured wildly at Volkov, his face a mess of anger and confusion. "Do you have any idea what your father is? What he does? And you think I am the bad guy here? You grew up with Richard." Her voice cut straight through his ranting. It wasn't loud, just sharp and precise. "You hit a pregnant woman tonight, in your own kitchen. Everything else is just noise." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Richard collapsed back into his chair. He had nothing left. Volkov rose from his seat, slowly, and buttoned his jacket. He looked at Richard with a mix of pity and contempt, like someone watching a dull movie he had already seen a dozen times. "My people will be in contact with your lawyers in the morning. I suggest you tell them to cooperate. Any delay, any challenge to the divorce settlement, any contact with my daughter that she does not start herself, will be seen as you choosing to explore your other options." He paused. "I trust I don't need to spell out what that means." Richard was silent. "Good." Volkov turned to Kate. He spoke to her softly in Russian, and she answered him back. For a moment, the conversation was just for them, a world Richard wasn't part of. Then he kissed her forehead, on the side without the bruise, a formal yet tender gesture. He walked to the door and stopped, not turning around. He said in English, making sure Richard could hear, "In my experience, Mr. Sterling, a man hits a woman because he's afraid of what she will become if he does not." He opened the door. "Tonight you found out," and with that, he walked out into the rain. Kate stood alone in the entrance hall of her house, listening to the cars pull away until their engines faded into the storm. 2 of her father's men stayed behind. She hadn't asked them to. She was sure her father hadn't either. They were simply staying. It was just protocol, and Volkov's protocol was never up for debate. Richard was still sitting in his chair. She looked at him, truly looked at him, in a way she hadn't let herself in a very long time. Because looking at something that painful requires a kind of courage that's hard to find every day. He looked old. Not his actual age. He was only 54, but he had always worn his years like a perfectly tailored suit. But in that moment, he just looked tired, a deep exhaustion that had settled right into his bones. She almost felt something for him. She inspected that almost feeling, really thought about it the way they taught her in the 2 therapy sessions she was allowed to have, and she decided it wasn't pity. It was more like looking at a cornered animal that was no longer a danger. The fear doesn't just disappear because the threat is gone, but you start to see it differently. "You should get some sleep," she said. "I'm going to need you to be clear-headed tomorrow. There are calls that have to be made." He looked up at her. "Are you serious? There's a guest room on the 3rd floor," she went on. "I think it would be for the best if we did not share a bedroom tonight, Kate." His voice cracked when he said her name. It sounded like a support beam finally snapping in two. "Kate, I know. I know I have been. I know tonight was. Richard." She stopped him. Not cruelly, but with a firm sense of finality. "Don't. I've heard that sentence so many times. I know every single version of that apology. The one where you're sorry. The one where you promise it will never happen again. The one where you blame stress for making you act like someone you're not." She shook her head. "I am 7 months pregnant, and I am standing here with a bruise on my face, and my father's men are in my kitchen. We are way past the version where you get to explain yourself." He just stared at her. "Go upstairs," she said. "3rd floor. Get some rest. We'll deal with this tomorrow." He finally stood up. He walked to the staircase, put a hand on the railing, and paused with his back to her. She could see the effort it took for him to start climbing those stairs. It wasn't physical. It was the effort of a man walking into a future he didn't build and definitely didn't want. "Did you ever love me?" he asked without looking at her. She thought about it, wanting to give him an honest answer. "Yes," she said. "In the beginning, I did." He nodded once, like a man accepting a hard but necessary truth. Then he climbed the stairs, and she listened to his footsteps fade until a door closed somewhere on the 3rd floor. She stood alone in the hall. The 2 men were in the kitchen. She could hear one making coffee, which on any other night would have seemed insane. She pressed both hands to her belly, closed her eyes, and took a single deep breath. Then she went into the sitting room, switched on a lamp, and sat down to wait for the morning. She didn't sleep. She knew she wouldn't. She sat with her feet tucked beneath her, because her back had been aching for a week, and she let her mind sort through what had happened, like walking through a flooded house, taking stock of all the damage. What was broken, what was still standing, what could be rebuilt, and what had to be left behind for good. At 2 in the morning, one of her father's men knocked quietly on the door and said her father was on the phone. She took the call in the sitting room, keeping her voice low just out of habit. Then she stopped herself. That habit belonged to the old house, the house where Richard was always listening. She didn't live in that house anymore. The thought felt like hearing a lock finally click open. "The doctor will be there at 8, her father said. "This is for the official record. It has to be done before the bruises can fade." "I know," she replied. "How are you feeling?" The question was so simple and direct. 3 words no one in this house had asked her in. She honestly couldn't remember how long. She looked up at the ceiling, blinked, and said, "I am okay. I'm doing better than I thought I would be." "That is the strength in you," her father said. She almost smiled. "Don't get ahead of yourself." There was a pause. "Katya," he used her real name. "We need to talk about what's next. Your position, your assets, the child's future. Not tonight," she said, "but soon." "I know," she told him again. "You don't have to handle this all at once." "I understand that," she said, moving the pillow behind her. "But I need to know what I am inheriting. All of it. Whatever you've managed for me, I need to really understand it this time." The line went quiet again, but for longer. When her father finally spoke, his voice held a tone she hadn't heard since she was a girl. You might call it pride. "Then we will sit down. After the baby comes and you're ready, we will go over everything." "Everything," she repeated. "Everything," he agreed. She hung up the phone and just sat there in the lamplight thinking about that word. What it meant and what it would demand from her. The life she had tried so hard to build for herself, so far from her father's world, was just a fantasy. Not because it wasn't a real possibility, but because she tried to build it with the wrong man, on a foundation that was broken from the very start. The question wasn't if she could go back to the person she was before. That was impossible. She was different now. She was a mother. 7 weeks from her due date, she was a woman who had survived, and the evidence was right on her face. The real question was what she would do next, what kind of life she would build, and who she would build it for. She pressed a hand to her belly and felt the baby kick. "We will figure this out," she thought. She said it the way her mother always did, not as a gentle comfort, but like a direct command. At 6:45 that morning, she heard Richard come downstairs, much later than she had expected. She thought he would have tried something during the night. A secret phone call, moving money around, whatever trapped men like him do. They always act before they see how small the cage really is. She was surprised he hadn't. Hearing his footsteps, she wondered if the fight had truly broken something inside of him. He stopped in the living room doorway. He had changed out of his ruined suit and was now wearing a cashmere sweater she had bought him for Christmas. That detail was so strange that out of all his clothes, he chose one from her. In the morning light, he looked smaller. Not pretending to be small to get sympathy, but actually smaller. He was diminished, the way proud men are when they finally have to face themselves. He looked at her face, at the bruise she knew was much darker now in the daylight. She watched his eyes take it in, and she saw something change in him that didn't feel completely fake. "I need coffee," he finally said. "There is a fresh pot in the kitchen," she told him. He left. She could hear him moving around in there, the quiet sounds of a man who was totally lost in his own kitchen. 2 of her father's men were still downstairs. She heard Richard talking to them, a short, sharp exchange. Then silence, followed by the clink of a mug on the counter. He returned with coffee for himself, but none for her. He paused, glanced at her empty cup, and asked, Do you want anything?" It was such a small, pathetic little attempt at kindness. She thought for a second, then just said, "I'm fine." He sat across from her, but not in his usual armchair by the fire. He chose a small one near the door, as if his power in the room had already evaporated. He held his mug with both hands, staring at the floor. "My lawyers are calling yours at 9, Kate told him. "Tell your people to cooperate. My father flagged every asset for a reason. Fighting this will only cost you more." He looked up. "Is there anything left for me?" She had spent hours thinking about this during the night. The house in Aspson is not part of the agreement. It was purchased before we were married, so it's yours." She paused. "And whatever you manage to build from here on out is yours as well. I'm not trying to destroy you, Richard. I am leaving you." He was silent for a long moment. "There's a difference." "Yes," she agreed. "There is." His eyes went back to the bruise on her face. She let him look. Around 4 in the morning, she decided she wouldn't cover it up. Not today, not in this house. For 3 years, she had made herself smaller, quieter. She was finished hiding the damage. "I want you to know," he began, but his voice trailed off. "I don't need you to." "I want you to know," he repeated, his voice firmer now, which surprised her, "that I understand what I did. I'm not making excuses. I am not blaming stress or the business deal. I understand what I did." He looked down at his hands. "I don't know when I became someone who could do that. I don't know when it started, but I know it was wrong all 3 times. I know that." She just listened, weighing his words. She had waited 3 years to hear him say this. And now that he had, she realized it wasn't for nothing. It did matter that he admitted it. She could admit that to herself, but it was also completely, totally too late. "I believe you," she said. "I believe you mean it right now. And I hope you remember this for the next person in your life. I hope you hold on to this feeling and let it actually change you." She stood up, slowly and carefully. "But it doesn't change this." She walked to the doorway, then stopped and turned back to face him. "I want you out of this house by noon," she said. "Take what you need for a week. The lawyers will sort out the rest." He just looked at her, the woman he married, the woman he underestimated, and the woman he hurt. The woman he thought he knew. And he just nodded slowly, his eyes finally showing real understanding. She went back upstairs. The doctor arrived at 8 o'clock, right on time. It was a woman, which Kate hadn't expected but was grateful for. Her name was Dr. Harmon, a calm, professional woman in her 50s who performed the exam with warm efficiency. She took photos of the injury. She checked the baby's heartbeat. It was strong and steady, 150 beats per minute. A sound that finally let Kate take a deep, full breath of relief. She wrote everything down so it would be valid in court. She asked Kate if she was safe now, and Kate said yes. Dr. Harmon glanced at the 2 men standing in the hallway and understood immediately, without another word. "The bruise will look its worst in about 48 hours, Dr. Harmon explained. "I want you to rest today. And I mean really rest, not the kind where you're still trying to manage everything from your bed." She gave Kate a look that was both professional and deeply kind. "Is there someone who can be here with you?" "My father is sending someone," Kate replied. "Good." Dr. Harmon packed her bag and paused at the door. "For what it's worth," she said, "and I know this isn't my place, but I have done this for other women. I've seen what happens to the ones who stay and what happens to the ones who leave." She looked directly into Kate's eyes. "You made the right decision." Kate thanked her and listened as her footsteps faded down the staircase. She heard the front door open and then close. A moment later, another car pulled up. It was not one of the big black sport utility vehicles, but something smaller. She looked out the window and saw a familiar face, Elena, who had worked for her father since Kate was 12. Her face was impossible to read, but her competence was obvious in every single movement. She got out of a dark sedan, carrying a bag on each shoulder. Kate didn't know Elena was coming, but she wasn't surprised. She changed her clothes, brushed her teeth, and stood in front of the mirror for a minute. She looked at herself, at the bruise, the dark circles under her eyes, and the 7-month pregnant belly that had made it through the night. She whispered to her reflection, "Okay." Then she heard the sound she didn't even realize she was waiting for. The front door, footsteps on the gravel driveway, a car door, and then an engine starting. Richard was leaving. She didn't go to the window. She had no desire to watch him go. She had seen enough. She stood there in the bathroom of the master bedroom. Her bedroom now. Hers alone. She listened as the sound of his car faded, as the iron gate opened and then closed, and then there was silence. The rain had finally stopped just before dawn, and a special kind of quiet settled over the house. Elena knocked on her door at 9:15. "There's tea," she said in Russian, "and the lawyers are on the phone for you whenever you're ready." "Give me 10 minutes, Kate said. She sat on the edge of the bed, the same spot where she'd sat last night with that cheap phone, making a call she swore she would never make. She thought about the person she was just 12 hours ago, hands shaking, the taste of blood in her mouth, terrified of what she was about to do. She felt a deep tenderness for that woman, for anyone brave enough to do the right thing while being so afraid. She glanced at her real phone. 17 texts and 4 missed calls from people who had no idea her entire world had just fallen apart. She would deal with them later. She put the phone down and looked out at the gray morning. At the old oak trees she had always loved. Trees she would now get to keep for her daughter. They had found out it was a girl 6 weeks ago. Richard had wanted a boy, and Kate had just stayed quiet, filing that piece of information away. The baby moved inside her, a slow rolling turn that Kate now recognized as a kind of restlessness. It was the same feeling she got every morning, like a tiny voice was saying, "I am here now." "I know," Kate whispered. "I know. We're awake." She pressed her hand against the movement, holding it there. Beneath the exhaustion, the pain, and the overwhelming complexity of what came next, she felt something new. It was a feeling she had not had in this house in a very, very long time. Something she had almost forgotten was even possible. She felt safe. In the hall, Elena set down a tea tray while the lawyers waited on the line. Her father's men were quietly returning to their cars. The threat was gone. The Sterling mansion had, in a single night, become just a house again. It was now Kate's house. Her name was on a deed being processed in a Manhattan law office by 3 of the best lawyers her father could buy. At 9:25, Kate opened the door. "All right," she told Elena, feeling a new strength rising up inside her. "All right, let's get started." The call with the lawyers took 47 minutes. Kate sat in Richard's study, a room she was rarely allowed to enter, that smelled of his whiskey and ambition. She listened as 3 lawyers talked over each other about asset transfers and legal orders, and how Richard's team might claim he signed the documents under duress. She paid close attention. She only asked 4 questions, but each one was sharp, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. When the call was over, the lead lawyer, Calloway, her father's American attorney for 11 years, paused. "Miss Volova," he said, "I have to admit, you've understood this much faster than most of my clients." "Oh, I've been preparing for this conversation for the last 3 months, she replied. A brief silence followed. "Of course," Calloway said. "We will speak again at noon." She hung up and sat in Richard's enormous leather chair, the one he always made her sit in when he spoke to her in this room. She found it fit her much better than she ever would have guessed. It was not too big, not awkward at all. She rested her hands on the heavy desk, looked around the room, and thought to herself, "This is all mine now." At 10:15, Elena came in with more tea. She had the look of a woman who has handled so many difficult situations that she'd almost become one herself. "Your father called while you were on the phone. He said he will call you back at 11. Oh, and someone is at the main gate. Kate looked up from the papers she was reading. Who is it? A woman. She says her name is Diane Mercer, a friend of yours. Kate froze. Diane was her closest friend here, maybe the only person she truly trusted. Diane was the kind of friend who would bring soup without asking questions, and who, 8 months ago, had noticed a dark bruise on Kate's wrist and said nothing, though her eyes told a very different story. Kate had never told her the truth about Richard, trying to protect Diane, or maybe herself, or just the fragile idea of her own marriage. She was never really sure which it was. "Let her in," Kate said. Diane walked in, looking like she had been driving way too fast and was trying hard to pretend she had not. She was 41, with sharp eyes that had seen a lot simply by paying attention. She stopped cold in the entrance hall, stared at Kate's face, and stayed completely silent for 3 long seconds. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." The tight knot in Kate's chest finally began to loosen. It didn't break, it just relaxed, like hitting the perfect pressure point. "Tea," she said. "And to sit in a room that isn't his study." So they went into the sitting room. Elena brought them tea, and then quietly left, understanding this was a private talk. Diane sat opposite Kate, saw the new bruise, and still didn't say what most people would. There was no gasp, no prying questions. Diane just wasn't built that way. Kate said it simply, "He's gone." "He left this morning," Kate went on. "The divorce papers are filed. The money is being transferred." Diane gripped her mug. "All of it? In just one night?" She just shook her head. "How my father," Kate said. Diane stared. "Your father? The one who died when you were 12? Kate met her gaze. "He didn't." The silence that came next was the kind that makes your brain reboot to accept a new reality. Diane's mouth opened, then closed. She set her mug down. "He's been alive this whole time?" "Yes. And last night, he came here with several cars, several men, and a legal document that Richard signed." Kate's voice stayed perfectly steady. "So now Richard is gone. I have lawyers calling me every 45 minutes, and my father's men are here, making sure everything moves along as planned." Diane just looked at her for a very long time. Then, in her usual blunt way, she asked, "Who is your father, exactly, Kate?" Kate took a slow sip of tea before answering. "He's the kind of man," she said, choosing her words with care, "who, when his daughter calls him at 10 at night because her husband hit her, shows up in Connecticut 2 hours later with 4 cars and a pre-written legal settlement." She looked directly into Diane's eyes. "The kind of man who has been watching my marriage from afar because he knew all along what kind of person Richard was." Diane let that sink in. "And you're okay with all of that? With who he is?" "I am 7 months pregnant with a bruise on my face, and my father got me out of here in one night," Kate said softly. "I'll figure out the morality of it later." Diane reached across the table and took her hand, and she didn't say anything else. It was, Kate thought, the most perfect response she could have given. At 11 o'clock on the dot, her father called. As always, he got straight to the point. The Cayman transfers should clear by 4 p.m. New York is a bit more complex. Richard hid those assets under 3 separate company names. His lawyers set it up that way to make this whole process a headache. Calloway is on it. It's going to take 48 hours, not 24. Is that all right with you? Yes, Kate answered. There's something else. A pause came over the line. It was short, but it felt incredibly heavy. Her father never paused like that unless he was choosing his next words very, very carefully. Sterling made a call this morning. It wasn't to his lawyers. Kate felt that knot in her chest tighten right back up. Who did he call? A man named Gerald Fitch. Do you know that name? She sort of remembered it. He was a business contact from before they got married. Gerald Fitch is a Connecticut state senator, her father continued. Their relationship goes back 22 years. They've done things together that neither of them would ever want looked into. Another pause. After he talked to Sterling, Fitch made 2 phone calls. One was to a private lawyer who handles emergency legal orders. The other was to a contact he has inside the state police. Kate's hand gripped the phone harder. Richard is trying to fight the settlement. Richard is trying to build a narrative, her father corrected her. He's going to claim he was forced into it, that armed men threatened him in his house, and that the document he signed isn't legally binding. A beat. He's not totally wrong about the armed men part. Can he make that argument stick? Not easily. The document is legal, the witnesses are solid, and we have a record of your injuries. But it creates a distraction. It creates a delay. And in my experience, delays are the enemy of a clean outcome. A third pause. This one even heavier than the last one. I need you to be ready, Kate. This whole thing could go public. Sterling has friends in politics. If he drags Fitch into this, it could be on the news before we're done. Kate got up from the desk and walked to the window. She stood there for a moment, just looking out at the bare oak trees at the lawn's edge. Let it, she said. I'm sorry, let it go public. She was surprised by how certain her own voice sounded. She let that confidence settle in, testing it, making sure it was real. And it was. Richard has spent 30 years building a reputation based on power and control. But the real story, he's a man who hit his pregnant wife 3 times in 3 years and signed away his entire fortune the second his father-in-law showed up. That story isn't going to help him. Not with his investors, not with his business partners, not with anyone. She turned back from the window. If he wants to turn this into a public fight, then let him. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then her father spoke, and she could hear the pride in his voice more clearly than she ever had before. All right. But Papa, I want it done clean. No extra mess for us. Nothing that gives anyone ammunition about your role, other than what's already in the documents. Of course, he said. That was always the plan. They talked for another 12 minutes, covering every single detail. When the call finally ended, Kate just stood there, holding the phone, thinking about what her father had told her. About Richard calling Fitch, about the emergency lawyer. She knew Richard would try something. She knew him that well. But she figured it would take him longer to make a move. She thought he'd need at least a day to recover from the shock before his survival mode kicked in. He must have called Fitch before he even left the property, maybe before the sun came up. She felt a little flicker of something. Not respect, but an acknowledgement. He was still fighting. In one night, she had taken almost everything from him, and he was already on the phone with a senator. That, she thought, is what 30 years of brutal real estate battles looks like when it's cornered. It wasn't going to work, but she saw the move. Diane had stayed. Kate found her in the kitchen with Elena. The 2 women were standing with that stiff, polite distance people use when they agree to tolerate each other for someone else. The sight of it almost made Kate laugh, which was a real surprise. She didn't think she had any laughter left inside her. I have to tell you something, Kate said to Diane. And I need you to just listen. Don't react for at least 30 seconds. Diane turned from the counter. That is a very alarming way to begin a conversation. Richard called a state senator this morning. He's trying to fight the settlement. It might all go public. Kate looked at her friend and held her gaze. "I need to tell you before it happens, because my father is involved, and he is not like anyone most people around here have ever met. I want you to hear it from me first, so you can decide what you need to do." Diane crossed her arms. "What kind of person is he, Kate?" So Kate told her. Not everything, of course. She was still putting the pieces together herself, but she told her enough. She explained the family business, the years they spent apart, and the connection that never broke. She told her about the payphone in Stamford and the number she memorized when she was just 7. Diane listened, perfectly still, the way she always did when things were serious. When Kate was done, Diane asked, "Does any of this change who you are?" Kate really thought about it. "It changes the shape of my life," she said. "But it doesn't change my center." At 1:45 that afternoon, the call came from her lawyer, Calloway. The news stopped Kate right in the middle of talking to Elena about dinner. Richard's lawyers had filed for an emergency hearing. It wasn't a full-blown challenge to the settlement, not yet. It was a temporary restraining order to stop the money transfers, using the exact coercion story her father had predicted. The hearing was set for 9 o'clock the next morning in Westchester County. Kate stood in the hall, the phone pressed to her ear, as Calloway explained everything in his calm lawyer voice. She felt the first real surge of rage all day, a hot wave washing over her. It wasn't because she was surprised, it was because of his sheer nerve. Richard Sterling knocked her down, went to bed, then called in every favor he had, just to make her prove in court that she deserved what was already hers. "Calloway," she said, cutting him off. "What do we need to win tomorrow? We have the documents. The signed agreement, the doctor's report, 2 witnesses. His story about being forced is weak. So what else?" There was a pause. "Miss Volova, we need any documents from the other incidents. The 2 assaults you mentioned. Any text messages, photos, medical records. Anything that shows a pattern of his behavior before last night." Kate was silent for a moment. Her mind flew through 3 years of just trying to get by. "How fast do you need it?" "By the close of business today." She hung up the phone and turned to Elena. "I need my laptop. And go to the master closet, top shelf. There's a dark green box behind the spare blankets. Bring it here to me." Elena left without asking any questions. Kate walked to the sitting room, opened her laptop, and began searching through files she'd saved for 2 years and 2 months. It was a folder with a dark, practical name for a day she knew might arrive. It was simply called E for evidence. A folder she had never shown anyone. A folder she had added to, checked, and sometimes just stared at before closing, telling herself she wasn't ready. Well, she was ready now. When Elena came back with the box, Kate opened it. Inside were 3 photos she'd taken on her real phone while locked in the bathroom. 2 of them showed bruises. The 3rd showed a cut above her eye. The one she claimed happened when she walked into a cabinet. There was also a single handwritten note she made after the 2nd attack, dated and timed in the tight, neat script she used to make things feel real. It was something she could point to that was not just in her memory. There was also a printed email from an address no one knew about, which she had sent to herself. It was time-stamped, describing what had happened with a cold, clinical detail that took an hour to write because she had to keep stopping just to breathe. She looked at the contents of the box spread out on the table. This was 2 years of quiet, careful, and exhausting preparation. 2 years where a part of her always knew, even when she was too tired or scared to do anything, that this box might be necessary one day. She took a photo of each item with her phone, then sent them all to Calloway, along with the digital folder from her laptop. She finished by 2:40. Calloway called her back at 3:15. "This is more than enough," he said, the relief in his voice obvious. "Tomorrow's hearing will not go the way Mr. Sterling thinks it will." She thanked him and hung up, sitting for a long time with her hands folded in her lap. The box was still open on the table. She looked at its contents, the pictures, her own note, and felt something else moving inside her, besides the anger and exhaustion. This was something she never expected. It was something she never imagined she would feel, especially not today. It was grief. Not just for Richard, but for the years she had packed away into that small box. For the woman who took those photos alone in a locked bathroom and then hid them because she wasn't ready. For all the mornings, she told herself it wasn't that bad, that she was managing, that she had picked this life and could choose to leave any time she wanted. For the version of herself that believed for far too long that love was something you survived by making yourself smaller to fit someone else's idea of you. She pressed a hand over her eyes. She gave herself exactly 90 seconds. She counted them. Then she closed the box, set it aside, and called her father. "The hearing is tomorrow morning," she said as soon as he answered. 9 o'clock. "I know," he said. "Calloway already told me. I want to be there." A pause followed. "Katya, I want to be there," she said again. And her voice had that same quality she knew in his, that deep, unbreakable certainty. "I am not staying here while lawyers argue about my face and my marriage. I will be in that room." Her father was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he just said, "All right, and Papa, I don't want you there. I am sorry. I don't want you in the courtroom, and I don't want your men near it. I don't want the Vulov name connected to this tomorrow. I want it to be clean. I want it to be about Kate." She paused. "Just Kate." Another silence. "This is a risk," he finally said. "I know it is a risk." She sat up a little straighter. "I've been living with risk for 3 years. I know how that feels. I can handle it." She took a breath. "Let me handle this part." He took longer to answer this time. She could hear him on the other end, doing that thing he always did when he was truly thinking something through, that quiet sigh through his nose. The kind of silence that meant he was actually considering, not just reacting. She had forgotten she even knew that sound until just now. "You will have Calloway," he said finally, "and Reeves as your second lawyer. They are both excellent. I know, and you will call me the second this is over. Yes, and Katya." He paused, then tried again. "You were never just Kate. I want you to know that I understand why you had to be, but that was never everything you were." She held the phone, looking at the window as the last of the afternoon light filtered in. She thought of the 19-year-old girl who got on a plane, telling her father she was going to have a normal life. And she thought of the woman sitting here now, with a green box on her table and a bruise on her face. And 3 of New York's best lawyers were about to fight for her. She realized the space between those 2 people was not as big as she had thought. They were the same person. They always had been. One of them had just been hiding for a while. "I know," she said softly. "I know that now." She hung up the phone and looked at the clock. 4:18. The money transfers from the Cayman accounts were done. Calloway had confirmed it before her last call. The transfer of the Greenwich property was already happening. The New York corporate assets were the last piece, and they would be dealt with tomorrow, one way or another. Diane was still there. She had moved to the kitchen and was doing what she always did in a crisis. She was cooking. The smell filled the house with a warmth that Kate had missed terribly without even realizing it. It had been so long since the house had smelled like anything other than pure tension. "Chicken soup," Diane said without turning. "Do not argue. You need to eat something that is not tea." "I have a court hearing tomorrow morning," Kate said. Diane finally turned around and just looked at her. "What?" "Richard filed an emergency hearing to try to block the money." She sat down at the kitchen island. "I am going, Diane. I am going," she repeated. "And I am fine. And Calloway is the best lawyer in the state." She looked directly at her friend. "But I need you to do something for me. Anything. The woman I have been for the last 3 years. The one who made herself small, who covered her bruises, who said she walked into a door. I need you to be a witness that she existed, that she was real, and that what happened to her was real." Her voice was completely steady. "Because tomorrow, a man and his lawyer will try to rewrite the history of this house. And I need to know that someone who saw it, even just the edges, is willing to say so." Diane stood perfectly still. "I will be there," she said. "You do not have to," Kate started, but Diane's voice was firm, filled with a warmth that left no room for disagreement. "I will be there. In the waiting room. Wherever you need me." Kate just looked at her for a second, then gave a single, solid nod, just like her father did when a decision was made. She ate the soup. She ate every single bite because Diane was right. She needed her strength. At 7 months pregnant and about to walk into a courtroom, her body was the only real weapon she had left. She ate slowly, deliberately, with a focus that had been gone for years. It was the focus of a woman who had stopped just surviving and had finally started to live. Elena came into the kitchen at 7 o'clock and quietly said there was a new development. Kate put her spoon down. "What is it?" "Gerald Fitch," Elena said. "The senator. He is pulled out." She paused. "It seems a mutual friend of your father had a talk with him this afternoon. He told Richard's lawyers he can no longer help with the hearing." Kate just stared at Elena, letting the words sink in. "My father," she said, which was more of a statement than a question. "I wouldn't know," Elena replied, her neutral face saying she knew everything. Richard had just lost his political protection. Without Fitch, his case was weak, just his word against a documented history of abuse and a signed contract. Kate did not feel a rush of victory. She felt that strange calm you feel when a storm you've been watching on the horizon finally changes direction. It was not really relief. It was like letting go of a breath she did not know she was holding. She went to bed at 9:30, the first time in 3 years she had decided when to sleep. Lying on her side with a hand on her belly, she just listened to the silence of the house, her house. She thought about tomorrow, about walking into that courtroom with her name, her bruise, and a box full of carefully collected proof. She thought about a room where the truth would finally be said out loud by people who had the power to make it official. And she was not afraid. She searched her soul in the darkness and knew it was true. She was not afraid. She was something else completely. After a moment, she knew the feeling. She was ready. The baby moved, a slow, deep turn inside of her. "Tomorrow," Kate whispered, "we are going to tell them everything." She was awake long before her alarm was supposed to go off. It was 5:47 in the morning. The house was dead quiet. Kate sat up, her hands on her belly, her mind already racing through the day that was about to unfold. She had slept for 6 solid hours, the best night's sleep she'd had in 3 years. It's simple, she thought. Your body knows when the danger has finally passed. She dressed with purpose, not like she was putting on a costume for one of Richard's parties. She chose a dark blue dress, a color she loved, but stopped wearing after Richard claimed it made her look cold. Looking in the mirror, she thought, I finally look like myself again. The bruise on her cheek was a deep, dark purple, exactly as the doctor had said it would be. She looked right at it, without even a wince. For a moment, she thought about covering it with makeup, but then decided against it. She was going to court to tell the truth, and the truth was written all over her face. Elena drove her. Diane was already there on the courthouse steps, holding 2 coffees in the early morning light. She looked like she hadn't slept a wink, but she would never complain about it. She simply passed one of the coffees to Kate. They did not hug. This was not about comfort. It was about determination. Inside, their lawyer, Calloway, and his associate Reeves were waiting for them. In 12 quick minutes, Calloway laid out the entire strategy for the morning. It was fast, clear, and professional. Richard's lawyer was a man named Harrove, a senior partner from a massive, expensive firm. Calloway suspected he was rattled because Gerald Fitch had pulled out at the last second. He thought he had political protection, Calloway explained, and now that is gone. That changes their whole game. So what is his argument going to be? Kate asked. He'll claim you were under duress, that it was a home invasion and your signature was coerced. Calloway paused. And he will try to bring up your father's reputation. Kate just nodded. She knew it was coming. And we will object every single time. And the judge will agree, because a third party's reputation is not relevant. He looked at her directly. The evidence you brought us last night, Miss Volova, that's the core of our case. The photos, the note, the emails, they prove this was not a one-time thing to get a signature. They prove a pattern, a history. He met her gaze. You may have to testify about that history. Are you prepared for that? Yes, she said, her voice steady and sure. They walked into the courtroom at 8:59. Richard was already at the other table, wearing a dark suit and the silver cufflinks she had given him years ago. From a distance, he looked perfectly calm. But as Kate walked by him, she saw the tight clench of his jaw, the forced stillnesses of his hands. As she passed, his eyes locked onto the bruise on her face. For a split second, a flicker of darkness crossed his features. Then his lawyer leaned in and whispered something, and Richard immediately tore his eyes away. Kate sat down, folded her hands on the table, and stared straight ahead, feeling a strange and powerful calm. It was not the fragile calm she had spent 3 years perfecting in that house, the kind you use to avoid setting someone off. This was real. This was the calm of a woman who had nothing left to hide. The judge, Patricia Wynne, entered at 9:04. She was 61, with reading glasses on a chain and a face that gave absolutely nothing away. She opened a file, read for less than a minute, and then broke the long silence. Mr. Hargrove, you filed to block a settlement signed last night. Tell me why. Hargrove shot to his feet. He was a large, silver-haired man who used his physical size as part of his argument. He described cars arriving, strange men in the house, a threatening atmosphere. He claimed the signature was forced. He used the word coercion 11 times and foreign criminal elements twice, searching the judge's face for a reaction. Judge Wynne showed him nothing. Mr. Calloway, your turn. Calloway stood. He was quieter, more precise. He presented the settlement, the list of witnesses, and the doctor's report. He presented the photos Kate had secretly taken over the past 2 years. He showed the court a dated, handwritten note. He entered the emails into evidence, all with timestamps, from a woman who was clearly preparing for this exact moment. Then he argued that the issue was not who was in the room that night. It was whether the woman who signed the document did it willingly. And 2 years of her own records clearly answered that question. Then he said, Your Honor, My client is here and is prepared to speak to this history if the court would like. Judge Wynn looked at Kate over her glasses. Miss Volkova, she said. And Kate knew, the whole room knew, that the judge had used her real name, not his. Volkova. Either her lawyer had prepped the judge, or the judge was just that good. Yes, Your Honor, Kate said, rising to her feet. After being sworn in, she took the witness stand. She felt the baby shift, a slow settling motion, as if the child was right there with her. The feeling grounded her. Calloway gently walked her through the entire story, one piece at a time. The first time it happened, the date, the injury, and why she had not called the police. She answered every question with clear, specific details, not making it sound better or worse than it was, just as her father had taught her. That was one lesson she had held on to, even when she was pretending to be someone else. She detailed the second incident, the third, and finally the events of last night. Hargrove objected 7 times, but Judge Wynn only agreed with 2. When Calloway was done, Hargrove began his cross-examination, sounding like he was reading from a script. He went right after her father. Miss Volkova, were the men at your husband's home last night employed by your father, Mikhail Volkov? Yes, Kate said. And your father is the head of an organization which the United States Treasury has classified as. Objection, Calloway interjected. Relevance. Your Honor, Hargrove argued. The character of the people involved is. I will allow it, Judge Wynn said flatly. Hargrove turned back to Kate and asked the question again. Kate looked him right in the eye. My father manages business interests in many countries, she said. I'm not here to discuss his business. I am here to talk about the 3 times my husband struck me during our marriage. She paused. If Mr. Hargrove would like to discuss that topic, I am ready to continue. A gasp rippled through the back of the courtroom. Hargrove's face fell as he scrambled to change his line of questioning. Isn't it true you hid your family's identity from Mr. Sterling for your entire marriage? I did not share information about my family. No. And isn't that deception a form of Mr. Hargrove? Judge Wynn's voice was quiet, but it cut right through the room. Connect this to the restraining order, or please move on. Hargrove moved on. He tried 3 other ways to attack her story, but they all failed. Kate's calm, her precision, and her simple refusal to be distracted was a wall he just could not break through. She did not have to get emotional. The evidence she had carefully collected for 2 years did all the talking for her. When he was finally done, he slumped down in his chair. Kate saw him lean over to Richard and say something quietly. Richard's answer was a single word she could not quite hear. Judge Wynn took off her reading glasses. She spent about 45 seconds looking over the documents in the silent courtroom. The motion for a temporary restraining order is denied. The judge said the evidence showed a clear reason for the agreement and proved a choice was made for personal safety. The asset transfers will proceed as described in the settlement. She then looked around the courtroom. I also want to note for the record that the medical file will be sent to the Westchester County District Attorney's Office for a review of potential criminal charges. That is all. She stood, and so did everyone else. Kate sat for just 1 moment longer before she rose. For just a moment, her hands were flat on the arms of the witness chair. Her eyes were fixed on the front of the room, thinking about the woman in the bathroom with the camera, taking pictures of her own bruises and hiding them away in a green box. She thought about what she would say to that woman. She'd say it all counted. Every careful, exhausted thing you did alone in that room, it counted. You were building something, even when you thought you were just surviving. She stood up. In the hallway, Richard caught up to her. His lawyer was 2 steps behind him, saying something low and urgent, but Richard was not listening. He stopped 3 feet away from her. They stood in the hall with Calloway, Diane, and Elena forming a loose circle around them. Richard looked at Kate with an expression she had never seen before. It was not anger. It was not contempt. It was something stripped of both of those. "It's over," he said. He said it like a question that already knew the answer. "Yes," Kate said. "The baby." He looked at her stomach. "I want to be in her life. I know I do not have the right to ask. I know what I have done, but I am asking. Model." Kate stared at him for a long, heavy moment. She thought of her daughter, so real and so close, just 7 weeks from coming into this world. She thought about the kind of father that little girl deserved, and the kind of mother she deserved. A mother who teaches her what it means to face the truth. "The courts will decide that," she finally said, "and so will she when she's old enough. I'm not making that choice for either of you." She met his eyes. "But I'll tell you this. The man in that kitchen last night, I will not let him anywhere near my daughter. Who you become now is up to you. That choice is yours." She paused. "I truly hope you become someone different." And with that, she walked away. She never looked back. So she walked through the courthouse doors with Diane on one side and Elena on the other, with Calloway right behind her. She stepped out into the morning, into the clean air of a day that felt like a different world from the night that created it. She paused on the steps, taking a deep breath that seemed to fill every part of her. Diane slid her arm through Kate's. "Breakfast," she said. "Somewhere expensive. It's on me," Kate almost laughed. And then she actually did. It was small, but it was real. The kind of laugh that comes from a place you forgot was even there. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely, yes." Her father called at 10:20, while they were sitting in a quiet restaurant in White Plains. Diane chose it specifically for its deep, private booths. Kate had ordered eggs and toast and was eating with a real appetite, which she took as a very good sign. "Calloway told me what happened," her father said. "I figured. Judge Wynn is a good judge. She was fair," Kate agreed. There was a pause. The referral to the district attorney. "I know," Kate said. "I expected that. It is fine. It is the right thing to do." She took a sip of orange juice. "I wanted it to go where it was supposed to without anyone pulling any strings." Another moment passed. "Understood," her father said. And she could tell that he truly did. "Papa," she began, putting her glass down. "I want to start those conversations we talked about the business, the structure. I want to properly understand everything." She paused. "But I need 6 weeks first. The baby is due in 6 weeks, and I really need that time." He agreed, of course, telling her she could take all the time she needed. He said he wanted to sit down with her. "Just you and me," he had said. He would bring whatever documents she needed to see. No Calloway. No Elena. No one else in the middle. As the words came out of her mouth, she recognized her own father's precise tone in her own voice. This was the inheritance she had been running from for 10 years. "I want to understand it directly from you," she said. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for 4 long seconds. Then Mikhail Vulov said, "I have been waiting to have that conversation for a very long time." "I know," Kate replied. "I just wasn't ready before." She glanced over at Diane, who was studying the menu intently, pretending not to be listening. She watched the morning light stream through the restaurant window. She thought about the next 6 weeks, about the baby that was on her way, and about the house that was now, finally, completely hers. She thought of the green box that had done its job and could be put away forever, and the long road ahead of rebuilding her life on a real foundation. This time, it would be solid, not built on a performance or wishful thinking, or on a stubborn refusal to see what was right in front of her. She thought about the woman she had become. Katja Volova, who was once Kate Sterling, who had been locked in a bathroom with a camera. Who was once a 7-year-old girl memorizing a phone number. Who would be a mother in 6 weeks, and who walked into a courtroom this morning with a bruised face, told the truth, and won. "Now I am ready," she said just to herself. She hung up the phone, picked up her fork, and ate. 3 weeks after the hearing, the district attorney's office officially opened an investigation into Richard Sterling for domestic assault. The evidence against him was overwhelming. 3 separate incidents, 2 years of proof, a doctor's report, and the testimony of a woman who was done being afraid. Richard's lawyers released a statement saying he was cooperating fully. Kate didn't release a statement at all. She had already said everything that needed to be said. 5 weeks after the hearing, the last of the corporate assets were transferred into Kate's name. The complicated legal maze Richard had spent a decade building to protect his money had, in the end, protected hers. Calloway sent her a simple, one-word note. It just said, "Complete." She folded the piece of paper, placed it on her desk, and felt a finality settle in her chest that was so heavy she could almost touch it. 6 weeks after the hearing, on a Tuesday morning, as the light hinted that winter was giving way to spring, Kate's daughter was born. She was 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with dark hair and light-colored eyes the nurses said would probably change. But in that first hour, they looked just like her grandfather's. Kate just held her and looked at her, feeling a kind of power she had no name for. It wasn't just joy, though that was part of it. It was bigger. It was the last year, the last 3 years, the last 10 years, all crushed down into this one, single moment. This baby, this rooms, this morning. This was the real beginning. She called her father from the hospital bed, with her newborn resting on her chest. "She's here," Kate said. There was a pause. When her father finally spoke, his voice sounded completely different from how she had ever heard it, stripped of all its usual power. He just sounded like a man. "Is she healthy?" "Perfect," Kate said. "She's perfect." "And you?" Kate looked down at her daughter's face, at her dark hair and pale eyes, at the serious focus of a new person seeing the world for the very first time. She thought about the woman she was just 1 year ago, on a cold kitchen floor. Blood on her lip, her hands protecting this baby who wasn't even born yet, dialing a number she had memorized at 7 years old and changing her entire world. "I'm good, Papa," she said. "I'm really good." Just then, her daughter made a little sound. It was a small, impatient noise, the sound of someone who already had opinions of her own. Someone who would not be controlled or dismissed or made to feel smaller than she really was. Kate looked at her and knew with absolute certainty that this child was going to be more than okay. She would grow up in a home that didn't have locked bathrooms or hidden boxes, or that low, constant hum of fear. She was going to know right from the start what it took her mother 30 years to figure out. That safety is not something you are given by the people who are supposed to love you. It is something you build for yourself, on your own terms, in a life that is 100% your own. Kate Sterling had walked into a marriage with a name that wasn't hers. She walked out of it as Katja Volkova, a woman who was broken, hidden, and knocked down, but who got back up every single time, who kept a box of proof hidden in a closet for 2 years, who memorized an emergency phone number when she was 7 and finally used it at 29, who sat in a courtroom with a bruise on her face and told the truth until it was the only thing left standing. She had done more than survive. She had arrived. And in a room that smelled like hospital cleaner and new beginnings, with her daughter on her chest and her father's voice in her ear, her entire life was stretched out right in front of her. Like a door that had finally swung open, Kate held on and never, ever let go.